steps. Have any of you been to Chichen Itza or the Mexican Mayan? So the steps of Chichen Itza, how shallow they are,
Yeah.
very similar to the construction here in terms of going up. It would have been not easy to walk up those steps to the high place, and so that's the northernmost place that we will go in the journey. Right here, Dan is at the base of Mount Hermon, which overlooks Lebanon and then Syria to the east. And then when we come a little bit more south of Dan, we come to the city of Caesarea Philippi, which takes us into New Testament times. This is what you see as you're walking up the pathway to Caesarea Philippi. This cave, which now is dry, in the New Testament times, it was a gushing stream of water. The water, because of an earthquake, has shifted, so now it's kind of gurgling out of the rock underneath the cave. But in Jesus' time, this was like a flood of water coming out of that location in Caesarea Philippi. They say, I'm reading here from a textbook, it says that more than 5,200 gallons per second came out of that shaft. And the water flowed from that spring into the pools that you see there. Eventually, this is one of the major suppliers. I think a third of the water of the Sea of Galilee is supplied by this stream, which begins here. So Caesarea Philippi was renamed and reconstructed by Philip the Tetrarch, one of Herod's sons that we met on the first night. He got the rule of this northernmost region upon Herod's death. And he built the Caesarea Philippi. Herod actually started it to honor Caesar Augustus, but by the time Philip got around to kind of finishing it, the Caesar was Tiberius, so Caesarea Philippi is more associated with Tiberius. So as you walk up the pathway now, you can kind of traverse. If you're looking at it this way, here is that big cave that we saw a moment ago, and along here was kind of like a walkway of temples to various gods and goddesses in the Roman pantheon. The temple that was here, right in front of this big gusher, was the temple to Caesar. The worship of Caesar was starting to pick up steam at this point, and then there's a whole series of temples. It really goes right along in terms of the various gods that you could worship as you came to this location and kind of walked this mall, if you will, of various gods. Artist rendition of it goes something like this. You have the cave here and the temple to Caesar, and then various kind of other styles of temples depending on what god was being worshipped and sacrificed to and so forth. And so it was kind of their destination for religious retreats and so forth here in the north. You could, it was completely Roman town. This was not a Jewish place. Jews hardly would go here, although we'll see that Jesus did. Here's looking from the other perspective. You're looking back at the cave here, and then the various niches and temples and so forth, some of them carved into the rock. There would have been idols in each of these niches that people would worship. This cave was associated with Hades, with going into Hades. It was fearful, it was dark, water was gushing out, and so it came to be associated with the entrance to Hades. And you'll see in Mark chapter 16, Jesus is using this as a backdrop when he says, the gates of Hades will not prevail against my church. And so he's kind of associating the setting with the teaching that he's giving there. Let's see what else we got. Now we're further along the walkway, again looking back towards the big cave, and you see the various niches and temples for the worship of the pagan gods. This is an artist's rendition of what the city might have looked like. Obviously you have the temple point here, where there's a lot of, you know, residential areas and government buildings and so forth, because, you know, people were living here and so forth in these days. And there is more excavation being done here than we ordinarily see, because there was a lot of people who were living here. The city originally, before it was called Caesarea Philippi, was called Banias, and it's associated with the Greek god Pan. Now, I don't expect you to remember this, but the Greek god Pan is the god who has the torso of a man and the lower torso and legs of a deer. So if you can picture that, he's got hoofs and he's got a tail and I think horns, and that he was associated with the forest. So he was the god of the forest. And he ordinarily did not have a temple, because the whole idea of Pan worship was you go out into nature and you worship him in nature. And so there is a section of that mall of temples where Pan is recognized, but it's not a temple. It's kind of just an open area. But he was the god of nature. He had to do with hunting. He had to do with provision. And of course, always there's some element of fertility involved. So, you know, these kinds of things all come together in the worship of Pan. So let me see if there's anything else. So this is recorded in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus takes his disciples on a field trip to Caesarea Philippi. Let me see if I have it here. Matthew chapter 16, and here's what Matthew writes about this field trip. It says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, kind of keeping in mind that he's looking at all these temples that have been built for all these gods, and he says, well, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, that you can see the setting, will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone he was the Messiah. So they're coming around to kind of understanding who Jesus really is and the mission that he's really on. But he's kind of swearing them to secrecy at this point, because that begins the last time Jesus, picture where they are, they're way up north in Caesarea Philippi. From there, Jesus begins to travel south, and he steadily moves south to Jerusalem, and then to Holy Week. So that's kind of like the turning of the page as Jesus then moves towards the crucifixion in terms of that setting. So all that is happening in Banias, and then called Caesarea Philippi. Interestingly enough, if you go there today, they call this Banias, with the B. And it's because the Arabs couldn't pronounce the B. So it's Banias, but it's supposed to be with the B. So let's see, I have a film.